Racist white woman humiliates a black man on the plane, and then his true identity is revealed. Not every battle begins with gunfire. Some require only a single look of contempt. A dramatic and gripping story is unfolding. If you want to follow it to the end, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any powerful emotional stories from Black Strength Stories. At Gate 12, the first-class boarding area of Miami International Airport, a quiet stream of passengers moved through each security checkpoint. Nothing unusual happened that morning until Harold Johnson walked in. He wore a gray hoodie with the hood up, pulled a worn Samsonite suitcase, and carried a faded leather backpack, the kind of man no one would guess the identity of by appearance alone. No one recognized the 52-year-old as the founder of Johnson Stratatech, a $4.2 billion aerospace defense tech corporation specializing in stealth radar and flight control systems for the U.S. military and NATO partners. No one saw that he had spoken at Davos. No one knew he had once been the lead engineer at NASA before becoming a strategic security advisor. All they saw was a regular black man standing in the priority line. But for Jessica White, a white woman around 50, dressed in a cream Chanel dress, carrying a $22,000 Hermes Birkin bag with perfectly styled blonde curls, just one look was more than enough to judge. She turned around, her face pinched with disapproval. "You're at the wrong gate. Economy is over there," she said. Not loudly, but just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The air thickened instantly. Harold raised his head, looking directly at her, his voice calm. "I have a first-class ticket." Jessica let out a soft laugh, one that had no joy in it. "Oh, I'm sure you do. People like you always think that," she said, her eyes dropping to his simple sneakers, before turning toward the nearest flight attendant for help. The attention in the lounge shifted. Some passengers began to glance over, a few quietly pulling out their phones. Then someone stepped forward, a male attendant named Roy, dressed neatly with a shining name tag. He didn't ask for documents, didn't check the manifest, didn't even look closely at Harold. He simply walked up, stood straight, and said coldly, "Sir, please don't cause a disturbance." Harold stood still. In his eyes, there was nothing but restraint. He reached into his coat and pulled out a ticket, not a printed one, but an e-ticket displayed from the airline app on his phone, clearly showing Harold G. Johnson, first class, seat 1AA. "You're saying I'm causing a disturbance, just for standing in the right line?" he asked, still composed. Roy didn't respond, but the eyes of the people around them said everything. A young woman standing behind Harold, likely someone in finance, whispered to her friend, "I think I know who he is. Pretty sure I saw him on Forbes." Jessica, however, had turned her back, muttering, "This is what society's become. Everyone thinks they can be wherever they want." Roy still stood in front of Harold, as if he were a security threat. No one apologized, no one verified, and no one, at that moment, realized they had just sparked an incident that would make the entire aviation industry bow its head. Just another ordinary day, until everything turned. From what seemed like a subtle comment, Jessica White escalated to open humiliation. As Roy, the flight attendant, stood between them without verifying any identity, Jessica seized the opportunity to raise her voice as if she were protecting a safe space. She stepped half a pace toward Harold, her voice ringing clearly across the lounge. "I will not sit next to someone like you. I paid for comfort, not intimidation." The statement immediately disrupted the atmosphere. Some people turned their heads. A few passengers nodded with implicit bias. But there were also eyes beginning to change, like those of Nadia, a brown-skinned woman in her early 30s, working in media, sitting while reading Fast Company. She whispered to her companion, What is she doing? That man hasn't said more than 3 sentences. Harold remained silent. Not because he was weak, but because he knew. In moments like this, any word of protest could be twisted. But Roy, instead of protecting fairness, turned to Harold and said firmly, "If you don't mind, we can move you to the back of the cabin, just to avoid tension." Harold looked up at Roy. "I have a first-class ticket. Seat 1A. The tension isn't coming from me, and I don't need to be relocated to pacify someone else's disruption," he responded, speaking clearly for the first time. Jessica didn't stop. She pulled out her phone, turned the camera toward herself, and began live streaming on Instagram to her 120,000+ followers. The caption was quickly typed, "Can't believe what's happening in first class today." She said loudly, "Guys, I'm being harassed by a strange man. Nobody knows who he is or where he came from. He looks suspicious and is acting threatening." When she called Harold a trespasser, a fraud, and even implied he might be carrying something dangerous, people around began to look at one another. A few hesitated. But one passenger, an attorney named Roy Marshall, en route to Boston, quietly began recording audio. Meanwhile, airport security cameras had captured the entire incident from the moment Harold entered the gate to the moment he was questioned by the crew. The airline's AI surveillance system automatically flagged the footage under potential discriminatory behavior based on language and conduct. And then, something no one, not even Jessica, was aware of. A senior executive from the airline was seated in the business class cabin behind them, witnessing everything. Her name was Nadia Ho, Regional Director of Human Resources for the Southeastern Division, an individual who had participated in numerous conferences on anti-discrimination in the airline service industry. But right at that moment, Jessica, still live streaming, turned the camera fully toward Harold, as if displaying an unidentified object. She asked directly into the camera, "See this? This is why I'm concerned. Someone dressed like this, looking like this, has the nerve to stand in the first-class line?" Harold said nothing more, but his right hand gripped his phone tightly. On the screen was still an unread email from the Department of Defense regarding his $220 million contract for unmanned aerial flight control systems. An ordinary day had veered off course, but what Jessica didn't know was that the silence she provoked was only the beginning. And the truth, once revealed, would ensure that no one on that flight would ever forget the name Harold Johnson. The EastJet Boeing 787 began rolling down runway. 2 at Miami International Airport. In the first-class cabin, usually a haven of quiet for executives preparing for major meetings, the atmosphere was now taut as a wire. Harold Johnson sat silently in seat 1A, the window seat, the most expensive spot in the cabin. The light from outside cast across his face, but there was no fatigue in his eyes, only absolute composure, as if he were waiting for something greater than this silence. Jessica White, seated in 1B beside him, still hadn't let go of the outrage she had constructed in her head. After receiving backlash from many viewers during her livestream, she turned off her phone but kept complaining. She summoned the flight attendant for the 3rd time in 10 minutes to change her glass of wine, claiming the last one had a strong smell, gave me a headache. Then she turned and muttered loudly enough for the passenger across the aisle to hear. "I didn't know the airline had lowered its service standards this much. There's a strange odor coming from the row behind. Or maybe it's from right next to me." Harold did not react. He opened a leather notebook, folded a blank page, and wrote in clear script, "When dignity is challenged, it's not the time for silence. But it's also not the time to lose control." Toward the back of the cabin, a silver-haired man with glasses folded his aviation weekly, and whispered to his wife, "Do you know who that is? That's Harold Johnson, the man who developed the navigation system for NASA's Artemis project. I read about him in Forbes Tech Titans last year." His wife looked up gently. "Really? And yet they're treating him like a security threat." Meanwhile, another attendant, named Caleb, was in the small crew rest area in the back, quickly Googling Harold Johnson on his phone. Within 4 seconds, the screen flooded with results. Harold Johnson, CEO of Johnson Stratotech, signed $1.1 billion air traffic software contract with the Pentagon, and keynote speaker at the 2024 National Security Forum. Caleb hurried to Roy and whispered, "Are you sure the man in 1A isn't Harold Johnson? I think we've made a serious mistake." Roy, now pouring coffee for another passenger, glanced briefly. "I don't care who he is. If he wants respect, he should act like he deserves it." The comment froze Caleb, not for its tone, but for its sheer and terrifying ignorance. Across the cabin, Nadia, the woman who had been observing from the start, remained silent no longer. She opened her laptop, launched a video editing program, and extracted a short segment from Jessica's live stream, which she had secretly recorded on her phone. This will serve as documentation later, she thought. Nadia had once worked as an investigative journalist at the Washington Post before becoming a freelance writer. She couldn't sit idly in the face of injustice like this. The plane continued flying above the white cloud belt of the Caribbean, but in the hearts of many passengers, a storm was brewing. A truth was beginning to emerge through glances, whispers, and the uneasy expressions on people's faces. Jessica now began to feel out of place. Her initial confidence had given way to caution. The stares were no longer aimed at Harold. They were slowly turning toward her. And in the cockpit, Captain Roy Danvers, a graduate of the Air Force Academy, had just received an internal message from headquarters. "This flight has a high-profile passenger. Code HJ-01. Please ensure there is no discriminatory behavior. We will monitor all interactions via cabin camera systems." Harold still said nothing. He turned to a new page in his notebook and wrote, "Dignity doesn't require applause. Only that it does not crumble under contempt." The flight continued, but from that moment on, no one on board truly felt at ease. As the seatbelt chimes sounded, signaling the plane's descent into New York, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin stretched taut one final time. Harold Johnson, the man who had remained silent and unshaken for nearly 3 hours, stood up calmly. Not hurried, not theatrical. He opened his leather bag and pulled out a gleaming metal card, a high-level clearance badge reserved only for individuals with access to top-secret defense intelligence. The upper left corner was embossed with the Department of Defense logo. On the right, Harold D. Johnson, Strategic Aerospace Liaison, Level 9 clearance. At the same time, he clipped the badge onto his jacket, as if it were a familiar routine. But in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. A man in his 60s, seated behind him, a former CFO of an international investment fund, leaned toward his wife and whispered, "My God, that's the man who spoke at the World Economic Forum in Davos last year. He talked about integrating LI navigation into multi-layer defense systems." His wife's eyes widened, then turned to look at Jessica White, who at that moment was beginning to tremble as she set her wine glass down. Jessica heard every whisper around her, and when Harold turned slightly to retrieve his coat from the overhead bin, she saw the embossed Johnson Stratotech logo on the folder he carried, the same logo she had seen on CNBC financial reports. The logo represents one of the pioneering aerospace tech corporations, valued at $4.2 billion, providing flight safety solutions to over 11 allied nations. She was speechless, Her face was pale. Roy, the lead flight attendant, upon seeing the badge, instinctively took a small step back. In that moment, every phrase he had uttered earlier, "Please don't cause a disturbance," or "We reserve the right to refuse service," echoed in his head like a slap across his face. Nadia, the woman who had been observing from the beginning, remained silent no longer. She looked directly at Jessica, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "What did you just do? Do you have any idea who you insulted? That man wrote the proposal to upgrade the nation's air defense radar system." Jessica gripped the armrest, eyes fixed on the floor, her confidence gone, her chin no longer raised. All that remained was fear and confusion. She reached to turn off her phone, the same phone she had used to live stream her contempt, but it was already too late. A young passenger in seat 2C, a recent communications graduate, had discreetly recorded the entire episode on a personal camera. From Jessica's condescending glance at Harold, to Roy's dismissive tone, to the stunned expressions when Harold quietly revealed his military clearance, every moment was captured. The moment the plane touched down at JFK, the footage was uploaded to Twitter with the caption, "A white woman thought he was just another black passenger, until he pulled out the badge that silenced the entire cabin." Within 2 hours, the video had over 1.2 million views, more than 390,000 shares, and tens of thousands of outraged comments. The hashtag #Harold Johnson began to trend across social media. Tweets like, "When you judge someone by skin color without knowing they built the aviation industry," and "Not everyone in a hoodie is a civilian. Sometimes it's the person rewriting the rules," flooded every platform. Jessica, still frozen in her seat, now realized some apologies can never be spoken, and some people only need to rise at the right moment to make the entire world reconsider itself. Within just 6 hours after the video of the incident on the flight was uploaded, the hashtag #Respect Harold Johnson surpassed all trending topics of the day, climbing straight to the #1 nationwide trend in the United States. It didn't stop there. Within 24 hours, it appeared in 17 other countries, accumulating over 94 million interactions, including shares, comments, and media responses. Under the hashtag, hundreds of CEOs, scientists, engineers, and politicians spoke out. One of the most widely circulated tweets came from Dr. Eleanor Graves, a former NASA astronaut who had once worked with Harold on a high-altitude sensor integration project for the SpaceX defense system. She wrote, "I once sat next to him in a Pentagon briefing. He never had to prove who he was. The world must prove it's still worthy of people like him." Reputable outlets like the Washington Post, Forbes, The Guardian, and even the BBC simultaneously published articles with strikingly similar headlines. "Racist woman publicly humiliates leading aerospace tech founder." The Atlantic's piece alone garnered 8.3 million reads within 48 hours, reprinting Harold Johnson's full biography. Graduate of MIT, PhD in engineering from Stanford, the mind behind 3 classified technologies under U.S. military control. Meanwhile, Jessica White, the woman who had so confidently live-streamed from her first-class seat, suddenly disappeared from all social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. All accounts were either locked or switched to private mode. But it was too late. Her name now appeared in thousands of angry posts, satirical memes, and was even used as a textbook example in lessons on microaggression and racial profiling. A LinkedIn post from a former HR director stated, "We cannot allow people like Jessica to represent the elite middle class. If workplace culture doesn't evolve, we'll forever stay backward." Within 3 days, more than 1,200 articles analyzing the incident, through sociological, economic, and human rights lenses were published. Universities such as Columbia, Georgetown, and UCLA began incorporating the story as a case study in courses on workplace ethics and bias in public spaces. Roy, the flight attendant who had acted unfairly during the flight, was suspended by the airline the very next morning. An internal investigation was launched, and the airline's media team was forced to hold an emergency press conference. On camera, they admitted, "We failed to provide an environment of respect for all passengers, regardless of skin color or social status." Amid all the noise, Harold Johnson remained silent. He didn't post. He gave no interviews. When a group of reporters waited outside the headquarters of Johnson Stratatech in San Jose, his secretary issued only one statement. "Mr. Harold Johnson believes that the truth speaks for itself, and he's busy creating greater value, not debating." No one knew exactly where he was, but social media began circulating a photo of him at a community school in Detroit, speaking to a group of young black students about satellite navigation technology, with a heartfelt caption from the teacher. He didn't choose the stage. He chose the next generation. Harold's silence wasn't withdrawal. It was how he made an impact, not with his voice, but with his character, his actions, and his dignity. As the plane leveled off at 35,000 feet, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin settled, but Jessica White's mood did not. Even though she had reclaimed her space by pressuring the flight attendant to relocate Harold, his presence still felt like a scratch on the flawless image she tried to maintain. She sipped her premium Chablis white wine, but its taste seemed to have dulled. Every calm movement Harold made unsettled her further, because it clashed with the prejudice she had so firmly believed, that people like him didn't belong in spaces like this. 3 seats away, Harold quietly set down his pen. In his hands was a worn brown notebook with the silver-embossed words, "Vision is not always seen." Inside were technical schematic drawings, encryption formulas, and a note to self. "The day they stop doubting you is the day you stop innovating." Even after more than 20 years leading Johnson Stratatech, a tech conglomerate whose satellite surveillance systems were used by both NATO and the Department of Defense, Harold maintained the habit of handwriting every idea. A female flight attendant, Nadia, approached, slightly bowed, and spoke softly. "We sincerely apologize for the earlier inconvenience, Mr. Johnson. May I offer you a glass of Glenfiddich 30? We reserve it only for official VIPs." The entire cabin fell silent. Jessica turned her head, eyes wide. "Mr. Johnson?" she repeated inwardly, thinking she had misheard. Her champagne glass froze midair. No one had ever addressed a trespasser as she had thought of him, with that level of reverence. And Glenfiddich 30? She recalled reading somewhere that the brand allocated only a few barrels to international airlines each year. Harold politely declined, offering a composed smile, then gently adjusted the silk scarf draped over his shoulder. Beneath it, a glimpse of his dress shirt revealed the embroidered crest of the United States Air Force Academy, one of the most prestigious officer training institutions in the country. Jessica exhaled sharply, not from the cabin's cool air, but because the doubt forming inside her was beginning to take the shape of an uncomfortable truth. Just then, the amber seatbelt sign lit up. The plane was passing through mild turbulence. Nadia and the crew quickly checked each row. An elderly woman, over 80, frail in build, sat across from Jessica, fumbling with her seatbelt. Before the crew could reach her, Harold stepped over calmly. "Let me help you," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but clear, deep, and reassuring. The woman looked up. "Thank you, young man." "That's very kind of you." The scene caused a few passengers to turn. No one spoke, but their exchanged glances had shifted. A middle-aged Japanese couple nodded to each other. A German businessman even pulled out his phone, as if to double-check a hunch. They began to remember seeing this man on the cover of Bloomberg Businessweek last year, in an article titled, "The Man Redefining America's Flight Technology." No one called him the black man in the wrong seat anymore. They began addressing him with their eyes respectfully, by staying silent rather than whispering. But Jessica? She sat frozen, her expression shifting from doubt to confusion, then to fear. She had just realized the man she had scorned was the one commanding the silence of an entire cabin. The Boeing 787. Dreamliner continued its journey in tense silence, but inside Jessica White's mind was a storm of doubt. She couldn't believe that the man with the worn backpack and humble demeanor had made her, a woman once proud of her sophistication, look utterly ridiculous. But her nature wouldn't allow her to let it go. Like a reflex from her days as a communications director at a fashion brand, Jessica believed image was everything, and anyone who tarnished it must be removed. When Harold pulled out his laptop, a ThinkPad Carbon X1, and opened an operating system marked with Stratatech's distinct logo, Jessica hissed and called out to Roy again. "I'm not comfortable." He just sits there silently. But it's suspicious. Check what he's accessing. Roy, though now somewhat uncertain after what had already occurred, still walked over. His eyes showed hesitation. Holding his crew tablet, he looked at Harold with a hint of unease. "Sir, may I suggest moving to a seat further back? There's a free seat in a quieter section." But he didn't get to finish the sentence. A warm, commanding voice rang out from the back of the cabin. "Harold Johnson? Is that you?" The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. A man in a Navy uniform, 2 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders, stepped forward with a wide smile and confident stride. He extended his hand, patting Harold firmly on the shoulder. "What are you doing here? I thought you were still presenting the new satellite strategy at the Pentagon." The man was Major General Philip Barrett, a renowned figure in defense circles, former commander of the Pacific Naval Task Force. Harold smiled and shook his hand. "Just heading back to Chicago for a few days' rest, sir." The atmosphere changed instantly. Passengers nearby began whispering. Someone pulled out their phone and looked up. Harold Johnson, stunned by the headlines. Johnson Stratatech awarded $2.1 billion contract with NASA. Chief Satellite Defense Advisor to 3 U.S. presidents. Harold Johnson, the architect behind the space encryption system that dismantled the global espionage network. Roy was speechless. He stood frozen in the aisle, staring at Harold's open laptop, displaying real-time satellite maps, something only top defense officials had access to. Jessica, now unable to mask her panic, had gone pale. Her hand clutched her wine glass, but the liquid inside was no colder than the shame rising in her. She lowered her head, trying to avoid everyone's gaze, but no one looked at her with sympathy. There were only headshakes and quiet, biting smirks that seemed to say, "You messed with the wrong man." Barrett turned to Roy, his tone firm but calm. "Do you have any idea who you just asked to move?" If you'd ever worked in the Pentagon, just hearing the name Harold Johnson would make you stand up and salute. Roy didn't dare lift his head. Jessica tried to protest weakly. I didn't know." Barrett didn't reply to her. He simply looked at Harold and said, "You don't have to explain anything to anyone. Just sit tight. Everyone's seen enough." The cabin fell into silence. But this time, not out of awkwardness or discomfort, but because everyone had just witnessed a living lesson in discrimination, dignity, and the danger of ignorant prejudice. As the plane cruised above the clouds at 10,000 meters, the only thing Jessica could realize was that she had just tried to bring down a man the entire country was working hard to protect. The first-class cabin of the flight from Miami to Chicago was no longer a haven of refined tranquility, but a space brimming with compressed emotions, furtive glances, weary sighs, and a lingering shame that spread like a thin mist. Harold Johnson still sat there, quiet, composed, as if the entire incident moments earlier had been nothing more than a passing breeze. He closed his laptop, slipped it into his leather bag, then turned to Major General Barrett, shaking his hand once more. "You can rest assured about the deployment in East Asia. We'll finalize the plan and present the full briefing in tomorrow's meeting." Barrett nodded, a smile layered with meaning. "The whole country's counting on you, Harold. Don't give them any reason to doubt." The remark wasn't just an expression of confidence. It was a mirror, reflecting the stark contrast between two worlds, one that judges through prejudice and one that proves itself through action. Jessica White, once a senior advisor for a humanitarian organization in Boston, now seemed like a fading shadow. Her face had turned pale, sweat beginning to bead across her forehead. She turned, seeking a look of agreement, a defense, a reason to retreat from the consequences. But no one answered. Even Roy, who had backed her from the beginning, no longer turned to look at her. At that moment, Nadia, the flight attendant who had stood on the side of fairness, returned. In her hand was a cream-colored envelope with a gold seal from the airline. She bowed slightly before Harold, placing the envelope gently on his drink tray. "Mr. Johnson, this is a letter from the captain. We are truly honored to have served you today. If there was any inconvenience, please let us know. Management is ready to receive any direct feedback." Harold nodded lightly, accepting the envelope without opening it. He simply responded in a warm, low voice, just loud enough to be heard. "That won't be necessary. I'm used to how this world works." No one understood that statement more than he did. Because he had walked from an MIT dorm room to the Pentagon's boardrooms, enduring hundreds of instances of suspicion solely for the color of his skin, and never once responding with rage. He had learned that sometimes silence could be more devastating than any words. He turned to look at Jessica, not with anger, not with mockery, but with a look of quiet sorrow, as if mourning a soul that had chosen to remain in the dark. "You know," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear, "the world still doesn't understand that our silence isn't weakness. It's so people like you have enough time to realize you're wrong." Jessica pressed her lips together. She couldn't utter a word. Her whole life, she had taken pride in her communication, debate, and expression skills. But in that moment, not a single word came to mind. All she felt was herself shrinking beneath the vastness of the sky, not from pride, but from the weight of belated realization. A white boy sitting in the row behind, around 10 years old, tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, who is he? Why does everyone respect him so much?" The father leaned down and replied softly, with pride in his voice, "He's someone you should learn from, not because he's rich or famous, but because he knows how to keep his dignity even when disrespected." And that was something Jessica had never understood, until that very day, over 10,000 meters in the air. When the plane's wheels touched down on the JFK runway, most passengers sighed in relief, ready to end a long journey. But for a few people on that flight, particularly Jessica White, Roy, and Harold Johnson, the moment of landing wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a storm about to sweep through. Just a few minutes after the plane docked at Gate 14, a 3-minute video was uploaded to Twitter by a passenger named Luis Alvarez, a Colombian tech engineer seated in 3D. The video captured the entire moment. Jessica insulted Harold. Flight attendant Roy unjustifiably blocked him. And, at the climax, the surprise appearance of Major General Barrett. No cuts, no edits, just raw, undeniable truth. Within 4 hours, the video surpassed 1 million views. The hashtag number sign Harold Johnson shot straight into the top 5 trending topics on US Twitter. By the end of the day, it had over 2.3 million views, 310,000 shares, and tens of thousands of comments flooding social media platforms. The media quickly jumped in. News outlets like BuzzFeed, CNN, NBC, and even The Guardian all ran headlines. Black tech CEO humiliated on flight, and his silent response stopped the world cold. At the same time, netizens began to dig into the identity of the woman in the Chanel dress. It took exactly 17 minutes for users to uncover the public Instagram profile of Jessica White, a philanthropist and self-proclaimed inspiration for modern women, who described herself as a fighter for equity. But in stark contrast to the image she tried to project, old posts were swiftly unearthed. A 2018 tweet read, "Everyone talks about equality, but I don't see any of them willing to share first class." A photo from a party at the Delray Bay Club with the caption, "White, and proud of it." A Facebook comment referring to Bronx residents as that unruly bunch. Piece by piece, the image was dismantled, exposing a hypocrisy that had once earned her speaking spots at 3 TEDx events. Now all rescinded within 24 hours. The airline immediately released a statement. "We are conducting a full internal investigation regarding the conduct of the crew on Flight AA1124 from Miami to New York. We do not tolerate any form of racial discrimination or unprofessional behavior." Roy, the attendant who had insisted Harold move seats without proper verification, was suspended indefinitely. An internal hearing was launched. But more importantly, there was an awakening within the airline and customer service industry. They could no longer evaluate passengers based on skin color or outer appearance. And Harold? When he arrived home in Chelsea, New York, where he lived with his older sister, a former military doctor, he didn't take a single call from the press. No exclusive interviews, no televised statements. Instead, he posted just one sentence on LinkedIn, where more than 9 million people already followed him. "Dignity doesn't need defending. It speaks when others go silent." That sentence, in just 12 hours, was reshared over 400,000 times. Among those who shared it were the CEO of Amazon, former President Barack Obama, and several veteran journalists. No table thumping, no shouting. Through quiet composure and real integrity, Harold Johnson made the entire world listen. 3 weeks after the incident that rocked social media, Harold Johnson appeared in Washington, D.C., not as a tech founder or defense advisor, but as the guest of honor at the National Conference on Racial Justice in Aviation and Customer Service. The event gathered over 2,300 attendees, including representatives from 42 airlines, civil rights advocacy groups, students in hospitality management, and even federal policymakers. Harold didn't come alone. Walking beside him was Nadia, the flight attendant who had maintained professionalism during that fateful flight. She wore a navy blue suit, modest yet sharp. The two stepped onto the main stage under the soft lights of Hall E at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center. There was no dramatic music video, no flashy intro, just a black man standing there in front of a microphone with a simple name tag that read, Harold Johnson, citizen, engineer, listener. Harold's speech lasted exactly 12 minutes and 41 seconds, much shorter than the 25-minute slot reserved for him. But each sentence was a razor cutting through decades of prejudice, no anger, no blame. He began with a number. There are over 11,700 commercial flights every day in America. How many of those carry passengers who are seen not as people, but through the lens of bias? Then he spoke of that day, Flight AA1124 from Miami to New York, but never named Jessica or Roy. I'm not here to name names. I'm here to ask questions. Is customer service being delivered through the eyes or the heart? The room fell completely silent as he continued. We've invested billions in passenger verification technology, but we've barely invested a cent in verifying the prejudices within ourselves. He didn't forget to turn to Nadia and say, "This is someone who didn't need to know who I was to know how to treat someone with respect. That's how you do your job, not with a VIP list, but with the ability to see dignity in anyone." Then Harold closed with a quote by Maya Angelou, spoken slowly and clearly. "I've learned that people will forget what you said, forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." A pause. Then the entire room, from airline CEOs to young interns, rose in applause. No shouting, no cheering, just a long, sustained clapping, like a belated apology to the millions of black passengers who had been ignored, doubted, or treated like strangers in the very land they too called home. After his speech, Harold didn't stay long. He exited the stage through the side, quietly as he had lived his life. But someone managed to capture the moment he handed Nadia a small lapel pin, the Johnson Stratotech logo, as a thank you. That image quickly spread online with a caption, "He doesn't need a business card. The world already knows his name." And so, from one brief moment in the sky, Harold Johnson opened a new horizon, where a person's worth is no longer measured by first-class tickets or designer suits, but by how they make others feel seen, respected. Harold Johnson's silence was never weakness. It was the noblest form of protest, in a world where prejudice still quietly operates behind each glance, each seemingly harmless word. That flight wasn't just a journey between two cities. It was a test. Who we think we are, and who we truly face when the polite mask falls. Jessica White wasn't an outlier. She represented millions who believe power lies in seating, skin tone, or the price tag of a handbag. But in the end, it was a handshake from a general, a look from another passenger, and a humble speech that tipped the scales. And the question remains, who will you be on the next flight? The one who judges, or the one who dares to listen? Share this story if you believe dignity needs no business card, and justice needs no shout, just the right look at the right time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories so you won't miss the next story that shakes the silent world.